Good afternoon. Very happy to welcome you to another installment of the Provost Graduate Student Lecture Series. I'm Chuck Tabor, the Interdean of the Graduate School, and I've been to all but 3 of these lectures. And I'm really looking forward to this one since I've known Kassie for a couple of years. She will be introduced in a moment by someone who knows her better than I do, at least knows her work a lot better than I do, and knows her better than I do too. But I wanted to tell you that in general, the purpose of this series is to foster communication across disciplines and to give students an opportunity to present their research to a general audience. So I'm really hopeful that we can get some of you coming out to future lectures. Please keep your eyes open for those. And I'd like to turn it over to Judy to introduce Kassie.
Thank you. So, for those of you who don't know, I'm Judy Lockhead, new to the department, and I've served on Kassie's dissertation committee for a number of years. I'm not her advisor. Her advisor is Frederick Moan and is not here right now. But the good thing is Kassie should be defending sometime soon, and hopefully by the end of this term. We're moving ahead, and this comes out of her work. She's actually presented this lecture at another conference, and it'll be it's not advertisement for going to see Porgy and Bess, which is now showing in New York in a kind of controversial new production, but it might end up doing that. So at any rate, Kassie's dissertation is called Race, Nation, Modern Music, Rio de Janeiro, Paris, New York, 1914 to 1945, and this is one of the chapters, so thank you.
Thank you. And I'm actually going to make a reference to that new production in the first paragraph. Porgy and Bess is perhaps America's best loved and most controversial opera. The song hits of Porgy and Bess are among the most frequently performed and recorded of any operatic work. The opera's opening aria, Summertime, for example, is one of the few of the operatic repertory covered by both Miles Davis and Janis Joplin. The opera's representations of African American folk musics and culture, however, have long been contentious. Written in 1935 by composer George Gershwin, a New York Jew, and librettist Heyward, a descendant of South Carolina plantation owners, the work paints a sordid portrait of Southern Black culture. The principal characters are Porgy, described in the libretto as a cripple, Crown, who murders a man while both drunk and high in the first scene of the opera, Sportin' Life, a drug dealer, and Bess, who is described to the audience as a, quote, liquor-guzzling slut, end quote, in the lyrics of the first scene. Critics and directors have long debated the best way to reconcile the opera's extraordinary music with their discomfort about Gershwin's and Heyward's seeming appropriations of Black folk idioms and their troubling portrait of rural American folk culture. In a recent New York Times video interview, Susan Laurie Parks explained that her reworking of the opera as a musical for the current Broadway production sought to deal with the more difficult, and that word is Parks's, scenes by adapting the text to make the opera, quote, more truthful to the African American experience, end quote. Parks's comments resonate, perhaps intentionally, with the rhetoric of authenticity, which framed much of the reception of the opera since its 1935 premiere. At that time, composer and critic Virgil Thompson complained of the artificiality of the work's fake folklore. Folklore subjects recounted by an outsider, Thompson observed, are only valid as long as the folk in question is unable to speak for itself, and that is certainly not true of the American Negro in 1935, end quote. Citing Gershwin's thorough research, cast member J. Rosamond Johnson countered that Gershwin had written an opera that was at least 80% Negroid. Composer Hall Johnson lamented that the work suffered, quote, too little first-hand knowledge of his character types and their real music, end quote. And critic Marcia Davenport noted the references to African American folk idioms, but assured her readers that, quote, the work was derivative only so far as it should be derivative for the sake of authenticity, end quote. In these commentaries, from white and African American critics alike, the work's aesthetic success is directly linked to its perceived authenticity and particularly by an understanding of the score's fidelity to African American folk traditions. In my talk today, my primary interest is not the authenticity of the work as such. Rather, I am interested in the discourses of authenticity that surrounded both the opera's production and reception at the time of its premiere. Why did discourses of authenticity surface in the responses to the opera? How did the composers and librettists' commentaries before the premiere shape that discourse? And finally, how does the discourse of authenticity in Porgy and Bess engage with broader ideas about race, representation, and the American folk? I suggest that in order to answer these questions, we need to view the opera in both a broader and a narrower context than that in which it has traditionally been seen. I propose here that the opera responds at once to a set of transnational, national, and local discourses of authenticity. First, I situate the opera in a transnational discourse that used tropes connecting authenticity and first-hand experience to promote modernist art. Second, I demonstrate that it responded to a growing interest in American folklore and anthropology, as both of these fields gained unprecedented popular attention. Finally, I show that Gershwin's description of the work as a folk opera responds to contemporary conceptions about folk-influenced art developed by the composer's cousin, the folklorist Benjamin Botkin. Rather than viewing the opera as a product of any one of these contexts, I suggest here that both the opera as we know it and its critical reception were shaped by the confluence of ideas that interwove constructions of authenticity, suggestions of anthropology, and acts of appropriation. In the talk that follows, I examine the particular circumstances and currents that made this confluence of ideas possible. Before moving to these issues, however, I will briefly summarize the opera for those who may not be familiar with the plot, and I will give some essential background for my discussion of the opera's turn to authenticity. Porgy and Bess is a three-act opera focusing on the unlikely love story between Porgy, a handicapped beggar who travels about in a goat cart, and Bess, a beautiful but hard-living urbanite. In the first scene of the opera, Bess's lover, Crown, murders a man in a crap game, and she seeks shelter as Crown flees. In the second act, Porgy and Bess's love story blossoms, and Bess becomes a fully integrated member of the community. She is convinced to travel to a picnic on the wild island of Kittiwah without Porgy, where she encounters and is assaulted by Crown. She returns home in a fever and is cured by a series of prayers. A hurricane strikes, and the community clusters inside and prays fervently. Crown returns for Bess in the midst of the hurricane. In an unlikely turn, however, he rushes back out into the storm to save a young mother who sees her husband's boat overturned in a river. Porgy is seized, Crown is presumed dead, but when he returns alive in Act 3, Porgy murders him. Porgy is seized by the police to identify Crown's body, and Sport and Life convinces Bess he will not return. Porgy comes back from his short stay in jail, only to discover that Bess has gone to New York with Sport and Life. He sets off after her in his goat cart in a tragic but triumphant ending. The opera is based on DuBose Heyward's novel Porgy, written in 1925, and it is adapted from the 1927 Dorothy and DuBose Heyward play of the same title. The novel treats the Gullah, an African-American population who lived in the southern lowlands and the islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. The geographic isolation of the Gullah allowed them to create a distinctive culture with significant West African influence, which fascinated Heyward, a Charleston native, and his mother, an amateur folklorist who specialized in the study of the Gullah. During the course of Gershwin's collaboration with Heyward, the composer made several visits south in order to learn about local musical traditions, including at least 2 short trips to Charleston and a longer stay on Folly Island off the coast of South Carolina. In all, the composer likely spent 6 weeks in Charleston and in the islands off of South Carolina, but in the widely publicized accounts of these travels, Gershwin and Heyward appear as folk chroniclers, even ethnographers of Gullah life. Given the work's resolutely American and even regional subject matter, it is perhaps not surprising that Porgy and Bess has seldom been connected to the concerns of a broadly international primitivist modernism. Yet the concern with authentic representation in Porgy and Bess reflects the importance of that rhetoric in the arts produced in Paris in the 1920s. Darius Milhaud's 1923 ballet La Création du Monde, The Creation of the World, serves as the most famous example of this tendency. The ballet is allegedly set to an African creation narrative, a Fang story translated by the French poet Blaise Cendrars in the Anthropology Negre of 1921. The staging featured stylized African masks, costumes that evoked pseudo-African sculpture, and choreography reportedly grounded in African dance. A 1931 pamphlet proclaimed that the collaborators, Berlin, Leger, Mio, and Cendrar, made a study of documents in actually quoting here, made a study of documents in ethnographic museums dealing with black civilization, end quote. Yet if Cendrar, who translated the text, Fernand Leger, who did the costumes and scenery, and Jean Berlin, who did the choreography, had studied documents in museums, Mio, the composer, had not. Mio's study of black civilization was framed through his encounter with what he described as authentic music, which he heard in Harlem, but which, he explained in his autobiography, had, quote, roots in darkest Africa, end quote. As testament to the veracity of his experience in a Harlem cabaret, he noted that he and his companion, Yvette George, were, quote, the only white folk there, end quote. Mio's music for La Création du Monde thus collapsed Africa and jazz, an African-American music, in simplistic ways, seeing both as a sign for a single l'âme nègre, or black soul. In his discussion of the ballet, Bernard Gendron describes such rhetoric as evidence of an authenticist attitude. For Gendron, a focus on authenticism rather than authenticity allows scholars to examine the collaborators' rhetoric while problematizing the conception of l'âme nègre, or black soul, that is at the heart of such rhetoric. Gendron's conception thus allows scholars to consider the cultural, social, and historical importance of claims of authenticity, even as they acknowledge the very real limitations of those claims. While he holds up Mio as an example of this rhetoric, citing his narratives about his experience in Harlem, it is important to recognize that such claims neither began nor ended with Mio. Similar ones were made about the authenticity of the Rite of Spring in Les Noces, about Villa-Lobos' first-hand experiences in the Brazilian jungle, and about Martinican author René Maran's novel about his experiences as a soldier in Africa. Such claims demonstrate that narratives about research and first-hand experience, no matter how limited that experience might be, intersected ideas about authenticity and its role in modernist primitivism. There are several reasons to think that Gershwin knew La Création du Monde. While he could not have known La Création at the time that his own Rhapsody in Blue premiered, just months after the premiere of Mio's ballet in France, it became the work against which the Rhapsody was measured in the 1930s, and it is likely that he encountered it in Paris during his 1928 stay, if not before. Gershwin was also an avid art collector, with a particular interest in Leger, the artist who created the sets and costumes for the ballet. In this slide, you see one of Leger's costume designs, as well as an image of a Chakwe sculpture taken from Carl Einstein's Negaplastik, which is one of the texts that he reportedly studied, and I think the parallel is quite clear. Gershwin was not only a collector of modern art, but a painter himself. In this painting, done in 1934 and perhaps done at Folly Island, since he spent a lot of time painting while he was there, the connection to Leger's stylized figure is clear. So too is the composer's understanding of the concerns of l'art nègre. Like the collaborators of La Création du Monde, Gershwin and Heyward documented their research before the premiere of Porgy and Bess. These accounts portrayed Gershwin's relatively brief encounter with the gullah as a much deeper exchange. In private communications, Gershwin and Heyward discussed those moments in the score that bore the fruit of this research. Inspired by the music he heard at the threshold to a North Carolina church, Gershwin wrote to Heyward that he had composed a scene with, quote, 6 different prayers sung simultaneously, end quote, and that it had, quote, somewhat the effect we heard in Hendersonville as we stood outside the Holy Rollers Church, end quote. The clip of these 6 simultaneous prayers is taken from Act 2, Scene 4, as the community takes shelter during the hurricane, but it recalls the prayers sung for Bess in the prior scene, and the accompanying scene shows the scene as it was realized in the Theatre Guild production. Heyward repeated Gershwin's account in his account of the genesis of the prayer scene in an article for The Stage magazine, which in turn became the basis for a series of short articles published in the New York Times. The connections between Gershwin's visit to the Carolinas and the musical materials of the finished opera were thus intentionally publicized in the weeks and months leading up to the premiere. If Gershwin attempted to capture the affect of his experience hearing multiple prayers simultaneously, it appears that he turned to the cast members for validation. Todd Duncan, who created the role of Porgy, notes that in a rehearsal of the shorter version of the sequence in Act 2, Scene 3, Ruby Elsie's performance as Serena and the prayer sequence she led literally brought the show to a halt, so spellbound were the performers. As Duncan frames it, in this moment Gershwin realized that, quote, he had put down on paper accurately and truthfully something from the depth of soul of a South Carolina Negro woman who feels the need to help and carries her troubles to God, end quote. Duncan's language is remarkable in two ways. First, it focuses on accurate and truthful transcription of an affect, if not of musical substance. But second, the passage suggests that despite Heyward's ample commentary on the specificity of the Gullah experience, Gershwin ultimately saw the opera as a tale of Charleston Negroes, and those are his words. He thus appears to have seen his African-American cast as judges of the musical authenticity of the performance not by their experience. The cast was overwhelmingly urban, northern, middle and upper middle class, and college educated, and none were Gullah, but by virtue of their race. Despite Duncan's laudatory tone then, the narrative suggests the ways that the rhetoric of l'âme nègre influenced even Gershwin's reactions to his own work. The published accounts of Gershwin's and Heyward's experiences betray their debts to recent work in American anthropology. Heyward wrote of the 5-week stay at Folly Island. James Island, with its large population of primitive Gullah Negroes, lay adjacent and furnished us with a laboratory in which to test our theories, as well as an inexhaustible source of folk materials. In describing the island as a laboratory, Heyward suggests that the trip consisted of a kind of empirical research, with theories and human laboratories in which to test them. As strange as such rhetoric sounds to present-day audiences, it resonated with the anthropological writing of its era. Margaret Mead's 1928 bestseller, Coming of Age in Samoa, compares the approach of the biologist, who tests his hypotheses in the laboratory, to the ethnologist, who, quote, conducts a human experiment, end quote, over the course of a stay with so-called primitive peoples. This anthropological rhetoric of the human laboratory was widely disseminated. An unsigned New York Times article published later in the same month reiterated the idea that James Island was, quote, used as a laboratory, end quote, by the composer and librettist. Further, Heyward points not only to Gershwin's careful observation of Gullah musical traditions, but also his active participation in them, avoiding the phrase participant observer, but clearly evoking the idea. Private correspondence between the pair reveals Heyward's knowledge of then current anthropological terminology and ideas. He wrote to Gershwin in 1934, I have discovered for the first time a type of secular dance that is done here that is straight from the African phallic dance, and that is undoubtedly a complete survival. Also, I have seen that native band of harmonicas, combs, etc. It will make an extraordinary introduction to the primitive scene of passion between Crown and Bess. Heyward's references to discovery echo his earlier rhetoric about laboratories, foregrounding the scientific dimension of anthropology as a social science. His use of the term survival further demonstrates specific knowledge of contemporary anthropology. While the idea of the African survival is commonly associated with Melville Herskowitz's landmark text, The Myth of the Negro Past, a detailed study of the impact of African cultural retention on African American culture, Heyward's use here predates it. He thus shows that he was familiar with the term before it became part of mainstream parlance. Here again, Gershwin tried to evoke the scene musically. But having missed the scene that Heyward described, Gershwin instead requested that the drums used in Kunker, a West African dance production that had toured New York, be used for the opening of Act 2, Scene 2, as suggested by Heyward. Gershwin thus insisted on a kind of authenticity, the use of these West African drums, even as he imagined the music that Heyward described. I will play a clip of the music inspired by Heyward's account, which opens Act 2, Scene 2. And this image shows the Kitiwa Island scene, but there is no sort of clip of the original staging of this particular moment. So instead you're watching John Sublette and he's singing It Ain't Necessarily So. But it gives you an idea what the sets looked like. And you can't actually see it, or at least I can't see it in this scene, but in the Heyward quote that I read before, he talks about that it requires harmonicas and it requires brush combs and all of that bit. And that's called for in the score, so there can be no doubt that he was trying to capture this particular moment. In its musical reimagination of an ethnographic discovery, this example shows that authenticist ideas, grounded in American anthropology, and modernist primitivist tropes that conflated African Americans and Africans in a single l'âme nègre coexisted in an uneasy mix. Critics mirrored this odd and even contradictory conception of authenticity in attempts to connect the production's authenticity both to Gershwin's research and to the authentic African Americans performing on stage. The growing popular interest in anthropology in the late 1920s and early 1930s closely paralleled a growing interest in folklore, folk art, and folk music, and likely not accidentally. Franz Boas, perhaps the most influential anthropologist of his time, edited the Journal of American Folklore until 1924. His successor was anthropologist Ruth Benedict, one of his students. Both saw folklore as a subset of anthropology. A shifting political and economic climate in the early 1930s encouraged a broad-based interest in the folk. A 1932 MoMA exhibition examined American folk art from the 18th and 19th centuries, and a series of folk song collections were issued in this era. African American folk music featured prominently in Dorothy and DuBose Heyward's 1927 play Porgy, on which the opera is based, in Mark Connolly's Pulitzer Prize-winning play The Green Pastures, and in composer Hall Johnson's Run Little Chillin'. A series of folk performers were invited to the White House to perform in the early 1930s, including, in 1934, a Charleston group that came and sang in Gullah dialect at the White House. Gershwin is often seen as removed from these trends. Indeed, scholars frequently suggest that one reason to withhold judgment of the composer's folk opera, as he called it, is his failure to fully understand the resonances of that term in the context of the 1930s. But Ray Allen has observed that Heyward's novel Porgy served as an exemplar of folklorist Benjamin Botkin's platform for new regionalism in literature. Yet I argue that the ideas Botkin outlined also resonate with Gershwin and Heyward's larger concept of an American folk opera. Botkin, an academic by training, held a Catholic conception of what he called folksay, which included, quote, literature about the folk as well as literature of the folk, end quote. This conception, connecting depictions of the folk to folklore, presages Gershwin's startling claim that Porgy and Bess was composed of folk songs that the composer himself had written. And I'll just take a minute to think about the historiographical impact of that one of the criticisms that's been sort of leveled against Porgy and Bess is that it's folklore, and the term folklore was coined to describe the work that Benjamin Botkin did. So it has sort of even an impact on further reception. There is a likely reason for this confluence of ideas. Gershwin and Botkin were cousins and remained in touch for much of the lengthy period of Porgy and Bess's genesis. Although there are few letters between the two, Gershwin wrote Botkin in 1929 to thank him for sending the first volume of Folksay, a regional miscellany. He congratulated Botkin on the publication, calling it a fine thing. The letter also refers to Botkin's suggestion that Gershwin compose a piece on Percy McKee's poem, The Gobbler of God, a work based on the poet's folkloric research in the Kentucky mountains. Gershwin gently declined, but the suggestion is significant. Botkin was actively encouraging Gershwin to set a work that would defy the boundaries between literature, folklore, ethnography, and music. During the Folly Island stay,
Henry, Benjamin's brother and George's companion for the trip, wrote to Benjamin to tell him about it and congratulate him on the birth of his daughter. Henry noted that, quote, George suggests you nickname her Dabs, end quote, an indication of Gershwin's continued, if indirect, contact with Botkin. And as you can see, that picture is actually taken on Folly Island. In his work on Porgy and Bess, John Andrew Johnson criticizes prior scholars for their, quote, failure to fully account for the bold naivete, end quote, of Gershwin's comments on folk music, and particularly African-American folk music. But as I have demonstrated here, Gershwin's decision to set Porgy and Bess as an American folk opera cannot be dismissed as bold naivete. Rather, Gershwin and Heyward's research among the Gullah and their willingness to highlight the work's authenticity reflect the opera's conscious engagement with the pressing issues of its time. The discourse that surrounds both the opera's production and reception is shaped by ideas that tie together authenticity, anthropology, and appropriation. The opera and its reception were informed by concerns with authenticity circulating internationally among modernists, by a growing fascination with anthropology, and a conception of folk art tied not only to Gershwin and Heyward's time, but also to their immediate circle. Reframing the work through its engagement with these cultural issues allows scholars to move beyond the dichotomies of authentic and inauthentic representation and to move into a broader consideration of the opera's cultural work. Thank you.